Jared Popley. I work for the Cortland County Soil and Water Conservation District, and I'm also a master composter. Today, we're going to talk to you about Composting 101 and getting back to the basics. So composting, it's a natural process. It happens whether we facilitate it or not. It happens all the time in nature. A tree falls down and starts to break down and turn into something else, but it's something that we can do on our own in our backyards, but it's a physical and chemical breakdown of organic matter. So physical in the fact that it mechanically breaks, and chemical in the fact that kind of the nutrients and things in the plant get recycled and turned into something else useful. So just like anything living, it requires food. So think of those as browns or carbon sources, and greens or nitrogen sources. And your compost pile also requires water, oxygen, and it's going to take some time. So why should we compost? Ultimately, it reduces waste going to the landfill. A lot of things that end up in the landfill, this is a graphic for New York State, just an estimate, but a lot of the materials that end up in a landfill could be composted or recycled in a way so they're not going into the landfill, making it so we can use the landfill longer. It also creates a useful soil-like product that we can use around our house, whether it's our garden, vegetable garden, flowers, around trees, things of that nature. And it acts like a sponge, so it helps hold moisture, and especially years like this year when it's super dry out, it's super important. And it improves your soil quality. So, and we'll talk about that, but it acts like a probiotic for your garden, so it adds a bunch of beneficial bacteria and insects and things to the soil to help your plants uptake nutrients better, and as well as help prevent diseases. So feedstocks, talked about that briefly. So browns are your carbon sources. They're things like sticks, leaves, twigs, cardboard, wood chips, things like that. And then your greens are your nitrogen sources. Those are the kind of high nutrient things. So your food scraps from when you made dinner, some of your garden waste that maybe you didn't get to in time and it started to rot. So the greens are kind of your wet stuff, and the browns are kind of the dry stuff. So the browns, they provide kind of the structure, like the house for everything. So they're kind of lofty and hold everything up, while the greens kind of provide the food and the energy. So some things to compost. So any of your fruits or vegetable waste, you had apples that were sitting out, maybe they started to go bad, they can go in your compost bin, as well as stale bread or maybe moldy bread, things of that nature. If you have old spices that have expired, eggshells, dryer lint, even your corn cobs from when you ate your sweet corn here this past week. Pretty much anything that was kind of living like a vegetable or a plant. And then things not to compost, these you really kind of got to be careful of. I know some people do it, but it's best not to compost meat or pet wastes, any fats, animal fats, grizzle, things of that nature. It can put pathogens into your compost, as well as kind of bring in vermin and things you don't want poking around there. You also don't want to use any dairy products, so stale milk, old cheese, things of that nature. They can also make compost piles go kind of weird and not good. It's also a good idea not to compost your pet's waste. They're mammals most of the time, so you don't really want to put that in there. It can create pathogens that then end up in your vegetables, things of that nature. And a big one is you don't want to put in any of your diseased plants. So if you have a garden and your tomatoes look like they have the blight or something's going on with them, you don't want to take those and put them in your compost bin. You could recycle that pathogen and bring it around next year. So same with walnuts. You don't want to compost walnuts. It creates a juglans, it's called. It inhibits plant growth for other things, so it's probably not a good idea. And same as any herbicide or pesticide. So maybe you mow your lawn, and maybe a couple weeks ago it was treated with a pesticide. You don't want to then add that into your compost pile. It'll actually make it so that it doesn't break down the same, so that it gets kind of funky and weird. So getting started, anybody can compost, no matter whether you have a big backyard or no backyard at all. There's a way to compost for everybody. So they all kind of hold and have the same kind of general criteria for what you need to get them started and going. But for when you feed them, you want to think of like a shovel full of browns to like a small handful of the greens. So you need way more browns than you do the greens. Or you can think of it as kind of a 30-to-1 weight ratio. But you want to pick your location. Ideally, it's a little bit shaded, maybe on a flat surface, off to the side of the yard, something like that. And then you'll construct your bin and construct your pile and start going. So it's always important to stockpile your browns for later use. So in the fall, many people rake up their leaves and store them away somewhere dry so that then they can add them to their compost piles later. You could also go pick up wood chips, but you want to keep those dry. And then the greens, you're slowly going to add. So you'll collect your, maybe once a week or twice a week, your vegetable scraps from the kitchen, and you'll bring those out. Then you build your pile, and you have to slowly add the greens like we talked about, and we'll go into a little more depth of that. And then occasionally, you're going to have to mix things up. So if you just left your pile as it was, stuff in the middle is going to be nice and broken down, but the stuff on the outside is going to still look like it did when you put it on the pile. And then if it's a year like this year, you might have to water it. So different kinds of bins. They can be made out of most anything. And kind of the rule of thumb is you want about a 3-foot diameter. So a 3-foot circle or a 3-foot square. But that's kind of the magic number for getting compost piles to work properly and in a timely fashion. The way we always recommend is to kind of layer your compost pile with browns and then greens, kind of like lasagna. Or maybe you make like a bird's nest. So when you build your pile, you'll add sticks and kind of chunky stuff to the bottom. Helps keep things up off the ground. And then you'll create like a bird's nest out of your browns. And then when you finally collected enough of your greens, maybe it's a small bucket full or a 1-gallon bucket, you'll take it out, pour it in on top into the bird's nest, and then you'll cover it up with the browns. So here's another example. There's a wire bin there. You can just simple fence, round in a circle. It could be a snow fence, things of that nature. You can build them out of pallets. You can build them out of concrete blocks, as long as they have that kind of 3-foot structure. Here's another kind that's a 3-bin system. This is kind of the really nice way to make compost. On the far left there is your stockpiled your browns for later use. And in the middle, that's where you're actively making the compost. And on the right-hand side is where you have your finished compost. And you're keeping that dry as well. There's all sorts of other kinds of bins out there, ones you can buy in the store. But they all do about the same thing. I personally don't think that there's any reason to spend money on something like that, but maybe it's an aesthetic thing and you want to keep it kind of out of sight. So the process, so you've built your pile, you put all the sticks in the bottom to kind of hold everything up, and you added your greens into it. Within a few hours, that stuff's going to start heating up. So there's bacteria and other insects that are already in the pile all over the place. They're going to start actually eating and breaking down those food scraps. So when they do that, they produce heat, and they also give off carbon dioxide as well as water vapor. So you'll feed it, it'll start breaking down, and then within a week or two, that temperature will slow back down. So after you feed your compost pile, it can get up to like 140, 160 degrees, depending on how much material you put in there. But most backyard home composting only gets to be around 120 degrees or so. But then after it's cooling back off, a different set of bacteria, a different set of fungi and insects and things will come in and finish that process. So that's why it's also important to turn your compost so that the stuff on the outside also gets broken down by those microorganisms and bacteria. So here's a curve or a picture showing kind of what happens. So the top one is kind of a bigger compost system. Say you put in a 5-gallon drum of food scrap that's going to get up really high in temperature. And the bottom one is kind of more of your backyard home composting. But each of those sections have their own kind of different kinds of bacteria and things that go in there. And I've seen it sold in the store, like inoculant for compost. Well, it's supposed to make it, there's enough bacteria and things already out there. You don't need to inoculate your compost pile. So maintenance and maturity. So there is some maintenance that's required when you're making compost, especially if you want to do it well. Biggest thing is to make sure your greens are covered. you just throw your greens on top of the pile, it's not going to go well. You're going to get birds, you're going to get things that come in and take the food. If you completely cover it, they won't even know it's there. So the brown's will act kind of like a filter to filter that smell, and they won't even know that anything's there. Like we talked about, occasionally turn it, maybe every other month or so, and then check the moisture. So do the squeeze test. So go in, grab a handful of it. If you hold your hand out and let it go and it all kind of holds together, your compost is good. If it all falls apart, then you should probably add a little water. Or if you squeeze and liquids come out, that's probably too much. And here's a picture of somebody. I think I got the wrong one. A picture of somebody watering their compost pile. So this year especially, it's important. And you'll also notice too, like if you get a big rainstorm that all falls on the compost pile, you might actually see steam coming off of it because the water will reactivate all the microorganisms in there and they'll go back to work. So you can make something that looks like compost pretty quickly within a few months. So you'll have a nice soil looking product at the end. But really it's not finished breaking down. So there's a lot of other processes that have to happen in order for that material to be finished. So there's other bacteria and things like we mentioned, but you really need to let it age for like 6 months and ideally a year. So if you add compost to your garden or whatever, and it's not finished and it's still kind of hot, it can actually pull nutrients away from the plants that you're trying to feed. So make sure it's matured. One way to do that is to take some of your compost and put it inside of a jar, and you'll take half full or so, put it in a cool, dark area, come back like a day later. If you see condensation inside, then you know it's not quite finished. Or if it's dry, then you're good to go. There's another way that I absolutely love to compost. That's called vermicomposting. It's using worms or red wigglers. This is done inside, and it's with a South American species, but every day they'll eat their weight in food scraps. So you keep them in a tote bin. You kind of drill some holes in the side, cover it with screen, and bed them with newspaper. But every, once a week or so, or twice a week, you can take your food scraps, put them in there, just like the bins outside. You have to cover them up, and the worms will eat it and create a really high quality compost. So you've probably seen in some of the home and garden stores, you can buy worm castings. It's really easy to make them yourselves. It doesn't smell. You can put it right underneath your cabinet in your closet in the basement. As long as you're keeping track of it and not putting too much material in there, there shouldn't be really any smell coming out of it. And it also creates a really high quality compost. So if you go to buy worm castings, they're not cheap. So you've made a whole bunch of compost. Now what? What are you going to do with it? So kind of the use depends on maybe how it's made. So if you make a compost out of just straight wood chips, it might not be the best thing to add directly into your garden to till it in. That might be better used as kind of a mulch around trees or shrubs or something like that. But you can also, if you're making it with your food scraps, that's a great one to add and incorporate it right into your soil. So maybe in the springtime, you spread your compost out and till it in a little bit. You can also do a top dressing with it. So you just sprinkle it along the outside or the top of the soil. You can add it to potting mixes, seed starts, all sorts of things. But what it basically does is it still has those bacteria, it still has the beneficial fungi, but it acts as kind of a probiotic. So that stuff will actually help break down more nutrients in the soil, make it more available for your plants, and they'll be a lot healthier. Here's another way it's my favorite way of using compost is making tea. So just like you make a tea in a cup, you'll brew this in a 5-gallon bucket where you mix some of your compost in the bucket along with a fish tank aerator and a little bit of molasses, and you'll bubble that overnight, and then you can water that on your plants. And basically it adds those bacteria and the good beneficial fungi and things right to the root zone of your plants so that they can uptake their nutrients a lot more efficient. It's really easy to do, and it's fun. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or shoot me an email. And, thank you guys very much.